right, welcome back to Biashara Tuesday. Thank you for staying with us here. We're having a conversation on business, the economy, politics, and now we are switching things up to world politics. Having this discussion with the director of the New South Institute, Director Chapkin, is joining me on Zoom live from South Africa. It is, they're trying to strengthen delicate democracies by building effective and accountable institutions. I'm seeing here on their website, of course, the various latest insights that they have been able to have a look at, bridging communities through thinking. And the director, of course, will be telling us, of course, how the role of the New South Institute is like in the politics in South Africa and also in world politics. But first, let's just have a look at let's get to introduce the director first, and then we can switch to this conversation. Good morning to you, Director Chapkin.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me on Kenyan TV. It's a great honor and privilege.
All right. How are things? Are you joining us from Johannesburg?
I'm in Johannesburg. It's a little earlier than it is in Kenya, so fairly early in the morning here, but a lovely morning it seems. And we've just come after a day of what they call the national shutdown, the kind of a day of protest. So I think today will be a little calmer than yesterday was. Although, frankly, yesterday was calmer than where a lot of people expected. So generally fairly calm in South Africa.
Right, true. And I think we're going to have a look at that difference in calm between South Africa and Kenya. Mass actions were experienced on both sides, but there was quite a huge difference in how it was handled by the government and the opposition as well. But, a bit later, we'll take a look at that. On your site, or in the message that you are trying to send, is that we are strengthening delicate democracies. What will you describe is a delicate democracy, and what's the one that's not a delicate democracy?
Well, I think all democracies are delicate, and what we mean by that is fragile, but not in the sense of fragile states, which is the literature which has come to dominate the studies of many African countries. We think democracies as a particular kind of institution are inherently fragile. We've used this term delicate. It comes out of really the experience of South Africa, but I think of what we call in the New South, and I'll come to that in a moment. So we've now had 30 years of democratic government in South Africa. The experiences have been a real roller coaster, as I'm sure for those of you watching South Africa from East Africa are fully aware. For the purposes of this conversation, there were some notable shifts. The first decade of democracy, and perhaps a little longer, there are quite extraordinary achievements in terms of state building. We build a national treasury, a revenue services. These are remarkable achievements, given that you must understand that by the end of the apartheid period, the apartheid government had effectively broken the country up into a whole range of separate countries. There were at least 6 nominally independent countries, so-called, had been given independence, and then there were a whole lot of others which had various degrees of autonomy. Each one had their own public administrations, their own health departments, their own police departments, their own education departments. Within South Africa itself, the country had been fragmented according to race. So there were different educational departments on the basis of whether you were white or Indian or colored. So extraordinary fragmentation of administrations, breaking up of the country into these virtually separate states.
Right.
Without, of course, legitimacy. So extraordinary achievements in the first decade and longer of democracy, of rebuilding, of building a sort of a unitary state. And then what we saw from around the mid-noughties, 2015 or so, a tremendous decay or undermining of these very institutions. South Africa's had a real sort of roller coaster ride. We think that this South African experience is one which is of great value and trying to understand for South Africans, but also more generally. I think it parallels experiences in many countries in the world, including across the African continent, but also in South America. Why are we using the term New South? Because I think a lot of our experience resonates with experiences also in Eastern Europe. So we're trying to bring the post-socialist experience, the transition away from socialism to some other kind of society in Eastern Europe, into comparison with the experience of post-apartheid and post-colonial societies. Yeah. In these environments, some of these transitions were directed towards democracy, and we think that that process has been very, very uneven in that regard, and we're trying to understand the complexities, especially from an institutional point of view, of why these transitions have been as complex as they have been.
Right. Is this, would you say this rough transition or the troubled transition could be the reason behind the phenomenon now called as state capture?
So we definitely think it's part of it, and for unexpected reasons. I know that there's this whole discourse in South Africa and Southern Africa and across the African continent of the sort of inherent corruption of leadership on the continent. We think that's nonsense. We don't think that African leaders or South African leaders or Southern African leaders are especially corrupt. What we're trying to understand is the institutional conditions under which corruption emerges. Mm-hmm. So what we pay a lot of attention to, and we think it's really important, is understanding the histories of civil service reform, of institutional reform. So we think a lot of the problems which South Africa has leading up to state capture are related to two things. The way in which the ruling party, the African National Congress, has understood itself as a ruling party in relationship to government, a tendency to conflate government and state, so a tendency both as a party and in terms of policy design to create spaces for the mixing of party appointments and state appointments. Mm-hmm. That's the first. And secondly is the way in which we went for new public management, which gave a tremendous autonomy to a whole core of managerial functions in the state, which the ANC were then able to deploy its own people into. So we're trying to understand state capture in relationship to these long institutional histories in South Africa. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, the term state capture, of course, comes out of the study of studies of post-Soviet society, of the transition away from socialism in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. So it's a term that's traveled from those countries, and we see there very similar kinds of political parties emerging, very similar relationships to the state. So we think that the point of comparison is very interesting. I suspect that in Kenya there are similar dynamics, certainly across Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, for example, there's similar dynamics. Mm-hmm. South America is interesting because that dynamic hasn't manifested, but for interesting reasons related to the autonomy of the security of autonomy of the public service in relationship to, for example, the state.
Right. So I was having a look at, of course, the various publications that the New South Institute has been doing, and yourself as well, the articles, and my most interesting one to begin with is the depersonalizing power. We have seen this appointment of executive officers to key state institutions across Africa, a complaint by majority of the citizens that maybe we are getting incompetent leaders into these positions, into these institutions, and reforms might be quite difficult when we have these kinds of leaders. Is there a way to depersonalize power? And what is it you could maybe point out through your research that you've done at the New South Institute? What will be the reason why we still have weak leaders coming into these executive positions?
So we did this piece of sort of open-minded research just to get a sense of, from a legislative point of view, not a political point of view, just from a legal point of view, what is the situation of how senior officials in key departments, the National Treasury, for example, or the head of the police, or the head of the prosecutions authority, how are they appointed legislatively? What are the requirements? So this is not a question of the individuals involved, their biographies, their personalities. It's from a purely legislative point of view. And what do we find? We find something quite astonishing. Mm-hmm. That in South Africa, the legislative requirements are almost non-existent. In other words, they set almost no preconditions for those appointments. So I'll give you an example. In South Africa, the head of the police, the legislation doesn't require any experience of police work. It doesn't require any particular qualifications. All that it requires of the head of the police in South Africa is that they don't have a criminal record. So we see similar kinds of laxity, of openness in this appointment across departments and across the state. We think it was deliberate. We think it was deliberate to allow politicians to appoint their people into those key positions. So it's not a question simply of the African National Congress. We think this politicization of the administration has been written into the very structure of the civil service. So this for us is a starting point. In order to start attracting the right kinds of people to those roles, we need to start with a process of structural reform. So it's not just about persuading the African National Congress or any particular ruling party, for example, not to deploy the wrong people, but rather we need to start with systems and processes. Let me just say one thing though. This politicization politicization in South Africa does not come from nowhere. Don't forget, the post-apartheid government inherits a bureaucracy and a civil service largely from the apartheid period and from the Bantustans. It's deeply suspicious. The African National Congress is deeply suspicious for good reason that this apartheid public service is not going to implement its policies. So it deliberately politicizes the administration in order to get the transition going, so that we can understand the reasons. The argument just now is that perhaps those reasons are past now, fulfilled themselves. And we need to move on to a different dispensation. And then in that regard, we've had a breakthrough recently. Late last year, the South African cabinet endorsed a framework document for what they call professionalizing the public service. And one of the issues it's seeking to address is this kind of structural politicization of the South African public service. So I think from that point of view, there's some very hopeful green shoots in South Africa.
Right. When we now switch back to the latest developments, such as especially the mass actions which have been experienced in Kenya and South Africa, structural reforms are quite a discussion as well there. So in Kenya, the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, is raising various issues, the cost of living being key among them. But the other one is the appointment of electoral officials, which he now says have been politicized to a point where the president might be appointing people maybe who will protect the next phase of election. So when you look at this as an expert in, of course, world politics, is this an expression of political differences, or are we addressing social grievances? Is there a line, or are these two things also addressed in the same regard?
Yeah, it's a marvelous question. So our sense is that sometimes the most fundamental things are things which academics and policymakers, and for that matter journalists, and this is why I'm very happy to be on the show, tend not to focus on. So in South Africa and in Southern Africa, and I think in Eastern Europe and in Latin America as well, many of the dynamics that make democracy fragile is the inability of governments to be able to perform on their mandates, deliver services, the language we use in South Africa, provide electricity. I don't know if you know that in South Africa there's a massive electricity crisis. I'm in Johannesburg and we're often without electricity for up to 12 hours a day. There's a water crisis, even though the dams are full. We sometimes don't have water in large parts of the country. So there's a real crisis of basic infrastructure, and this is related to the character of government. The constitution in South Africa, when it started, and I'm not sure of the situation in Kenya, and I suspect it's slightly different, went fairly far, not far enough though, fairly far in creating autonomy for some institutions. So we have a public protector, for example. We have tried to insulate some institutions from direct political interference. Interestingly enough, our electoral commission is fairly well insulated from direct political appointments. So it's quite difficult for any political party to second or direct their people directly into the commission. So to some extent, the constitution is done fairly well. But in the civil service, in the public service, local government and in provincial and national government, in those departments, in state-owned enterprises, that insulation is very, very weak. And it's precisely that weakness in those key institutions that political parties have been able to take advantage of to put their own people into. I suspect in Kenya, I don't know the situation in Kenya, it'd be very interesting to do that comparative work, but it sounds to me is that one of the things to investigate as journalists and as policymakers is the degree to which institutionally, in terms of the institutional design, key institutions like your electoral commission are insulated or properly insulated from political parties. In other words, how possible is it in terms of the law and in terms of process, is it for the ruling party or for politicians to deploy their friends or colleagues or allies or cadres into those key positions?
All right, great. And now, how would you advise governments in a delicate democracy to respond to such mass unrest? In Nairobi yesterday, several leaders who participated in those mass actions were arrested, including leaders in Senate, leaders in Parliament, and also the senator of the capital city of Kenya. I saw that in South Africa, the protesters were able to listen to their leaders and disperse peacefully, but it wasn't the same case in the streets of Nairobi and in various other towns where tear gas canisters were released to protesters, and also some of them including live ammunition. How does the government, or how will the government effectively respond to unrest in a way that it doesn't seem like they are, twisted or being arm twisted by the opposition, but still addressing the social grievances which are being raised by citizens?
I mean, again, this is another great achievement of South Africa over the last 30 years, is that South Africa's democracy is robust. I mean, there really is democratic contestation. The African National Congress has been in power for all this time, since 1994, but its own internal dynamics are complicated, but the opposition to the ANC is often fierce, both from other political parties, but also from civil society organizations. In fact, former President Jacob Zuma, who was at the receiving end of massive opposition, including from opposition around state capture, often complained that he's the elected president of the country, and yet he seems unable to rule because the courts and civil society organizations are able constantly to second guess his decision making. So, from that point of view, South Africa is fairly robust. Yesterday was an interesting experience. An opposition political party, the Economic Freedom Front, called for what they call the national stay away, to try and sort of close the economy for a day to demonstrate their authority. There were sort of worries of violence breaking out and of looting. In fact, the day was very, very peaceful. EFF turned out that was hardly able to deliver large crowds at all. Very, very small turnout for its protests. But what was interesting is that there was never a question of the right of the EFF to protest, never. So that right was absolutely respected. Instead, what the government did, for the first time actually ever, was a huge police turnout. So the police were present on the streets. From the reports that I've seen, they were pretty well behaved. There was an incident in the inner city of Johannesburg where the police seemed to break up an EFF demonstration in a fairly robust way, but I don't think there was any sense that no one was hurt or anything like that. And it sounds as if they were acting within the boundaries of the law. But generally speaking, the police acted within the law. The protesters acted within the law. The army, which was also on call, acted within the law. So yesterday was actually a remarkably peaceful day, and many people were saying that they haven't felt so safe in South Africa for a very long time, precisely because it was such a large police deployment in the country. So I think from that point of view, it does sound that South Africa is in a different place to Kenya. Our democracy is much more robust and perhaps less delicate than it is in Kenya. But there's one caveat to all of that. Mm-hmm. We are going into a period now where the African National Congress is clearly in decline. There's a real possibility that it'll fall below 50% in the next election, which means it will not be able to rule on its own. It'll have to rule in coalitions. We're in a phase of quite complex and turbulent coalition politics in South Africa. So there is a question mark over whether the ANC will be able to come to terms with no longer being a ruling party, but merely being one party amongst lots of other parties contesting for power. So that question we haven't tested that yet, and that's where we're heading, and that's going to be fairly exciting, I can say, also quite worrying and nerve-wracking times ahead.
Right. When it comes to matters of the opposition confronting the government, there's usually a talk of sometimes called conspiracy, but there's usually a talk of external factors. And do you think that could be also the case, seeing that 5 African countries yesterday participated in mass actions, and these were all also around the same theme, the cost of living, and all happening on the same day? Could we point to external factors, or is that just plain old conspiracy?
It's a fascinating coincidence. I must be honest, I wasn't aware of it, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'll look at that. There's a very great paper by an American scholar of Indian origin, Vijayanti Rao, and she did a whole lot of work on what she called simultaneity, the coincidences of events across the world, and she drew some very interesting connections. I would be surprised, to be honest, if there was any planning or any coordination between these events across these countries, especially as they're related to the EFF protest. If you mean a hidden hand in something conspiratorial and nefarious, I would be surprised. If there was some kind of coordination between an EFF planning committee and others, it would suggest to me a very great degree degree of thinking of South Africa outside of South Africa's borders. So I'd be surprised. I would be happily surprised by that. My guess is that it was a coincidence, at least as it relates to events in South Africa.
All right, great. You, in 2022 October, you published a very interesting opinion piece here on the Sunday Times. If China can make corruption work in its favor, why not South Africa? I've not been able to go through the whole piece behind the paywall, but I'd love to know, how did China make corruption work for itself, and how can Kenya, South Africa, and other nations also make it work?
Yeah, the piece is a little, it's not tongue-in-cheek, but it was an attempt to try and push back against some of the discourses in South Africa and on the continent more generally, that the overwhelming problem in our countries is corruption. So I tend not to believe so. I think that our institutions and our leaders are not especially corrupt relative to the rest of the world. And as it turns out, when you look at the situation in China, of which in South Africa there's a real preoccupation with China. The current leadership look to China as a political model, but they're especially fascinated by its experience of delivering long-term economic growth, high-speed growth, but also delivering infrastructure in a fairly remarkable way. So the Chinese example is very, very present in South Africa. I'm not sure that's the case in Kenya. But when you look at the Chinese example, what you'll find is, what the literature says, and what academics and public policy people will tell you, is that the Chinese civil service is very capable on the one hand. On the other hand, it's monumentally corrupt. There is a very famous book which came out, it's about 10 years ago now, called The Gilded Cage by Yun Ang. She's from Singapore. And what she describes, she's got this whole model of what she calls unbundling corruption. And her argument essentially is that the Chinese civil service is monumentally corrupt. What's interesting about the book, and this was the link into South Africa, is that she compares China to lots of countries, including South Africa, and what she finds is that Chinese corruption is similar to South African corruption. I won't go into the details there. What she argues is that in China, that corruption has helped facilitate development and growth. So the Chinese corruption, which is massive, ironically enough, has been an instigator or helped facilitate massive growth and massive development. In South Africa, it hasn't been the case. There has been massive corruption, but it hasn't been facilitator of growth and development. And I was trying to understand why. The difference, I think, is that in China, the civil service is corrupt, but it's also highly capable. Whereas in South Africa, the civil service, actually the civil service is not so corrupt, but the civil service is not so capable and is corrupt as well. So I think a lot has to do with those questions which I was raising right at the beginning of our conversation around institutional capacity, institutional design, especially as it relates to the civil service.
Right. Superb. And the deep pockets of China are appreciated across Africa. Their presence in Kenya is probably as big as it is in South Africa. And I was having a look at their investment. Last year, China replaced the United States as Africa's second largest trading partner. And these figures show that right after Europe, Chinese investment in Africa tops $9 billion. What should we make of China's surging interest in Africa?
Well, of course, commercially, it's an enormous opportunity. Seems to be lots of competition currently going on. China, America, obviously, there's Russian involvement. There's even Turkish interest as well, growing interest. In South Africa, Chinese investment is not especially high, except in certain areas. We still South Africa's largest trading partners are the European Union and the US, which of course raises all sorts of questions in South Africa because our foreign policy is very strongly directed towards China, but also increasingly, as you might know, towards Russia. South Africa remains, in the language of the government, non-aligned in relationship with the war with Ukraine. We recently were involved in the naval maneuvers with Russian warships outside of Simonstown in in South Africa. So kind of very close relationships with Russia. So, and yet economically our ties are in another direction. So in South Africa, there's all sorts of tensions around this. But I think China's played a very clever role in this regard. It hasn't tied its investments to notions of good governance or an anti-corruption agenda. It's been much more friendly or much more open-minded in relationship to the conditions of its investment. Although having said that, its investments are still quite commercially unambiguously need to be profitable. In South Africa, Chinese investment has a much more has a rockier. There's been a rockier tendency in South Africa. Chinese companies were heavily implicated in state capture, especially in the rail industries. Some of the huge corruption around state capture related to our national railway company, which bought at the most exorbitant prices Chinese locomotives. So Chinese companies in this regard have been, and China more generally, have been implicated in that period, in that experience in South Africa. So there is some cloud over China in that regard.
All right. Great. Thank you very much for those, of course, insights into various issues that are playing across democracies in Africa. How does the role of the New South Institute in strengthening these delicate democracies, what kind of impact are you looking to achieve, and how have you been doing that so far?
Yeah, so I think this conversation, hopefully, at least as I'm talking and realizing more and more that the complexities and challenges in our context in South Africa, in Southern Africa, in Kenya, East Africa, West Africa are enormous. The institutional challenges of dealing with the kinds of things that we've been discussing today. We think that one of the key ways of negotiating or navigating these very, very complex situations is by building the prestige and the capability of public policy thinking, public policy analysis. And that's really what the New South Institute is trying to do. We're trying to elevate the prestige and the capacity of public policy analysis in South Africa, in the region and across the continent. We're trying to link up with other think tanks on the continent, but elsewhere in the world. We're participating in London, for example, in the On Think Tanks conference, which is this huge global network of think tanks. We're part of. We're hopefully joining the Southern Voice, which is another network of global think tanks from the global south, to build these communities of think tanks to elevate the prestige of public policy, but also so that we can start developing concrete solutions to some of these very, very difficult challenges which we have. How, for example, to better insulate the Kenyan Electoral Commission from political interference, how to manage the electricity crisis in South Africa. These sorts of concrete questions require concrete answers, but the answers often lie in a deep understanding of our histories, of institutions, and of the politics, which we cannot just take off the shelf from best practice experience coming from the global north. So we need to find solutions to our problems based on our own histories and our own experiences, and by learning from those around us. And that really is what the New South Institute is trying to do. And I think we are beginning to achieve. We're doing a lot of work on migration, civil service reform, security reform, policing, and intelligence, a lot of work on welfare reform, and as I keep saying, a lot of work on trying to think the Eastern European experience in relationship to the post-colonial experience. And there, the connections are fascinating.
Right, and of course, I'm sure some of these reports and research evidence and the results that you receive from what you're doing, it's stuff that we can read on your site and also on the newsletter.
Absolutely, and all our stuff is available for free off our website and in various other formats. We're publishing it academically a lot. We try to put that out on free platforms as well. All our reports are available. More and more of our work is international and comparative. Alan Hirsch, who heads up a migration program, for example, they've just finished some major work looking at migration dynamics in East Africa, working with Kenyans. We've got part of our team is Kenyan. That work will come out soon. I think you'll be fascinated to read it and to cover it. It looks at migration patterns across Africa comparatively. It finds, for example, which is probably not such a big surprise to Kenyans, the largest movement of Africans is not out of the continent. It's rather between African countries themselves, of which Kenya, of course, is a key site of migration, both inwards and outwards.
Right.
South Africa is as well. So all of this is available for free on our website. Please have a look at it.
Right, thank you very much. And I'll be looking forward to that report, especially, and discussing it here on Biashara Tuesday with my other guests who will be here as experts. No, it's kind of hard to not discuss the electoral process when we're talking about democracy, and I think this is the last bit of this conversation, and I'd like to hear your input on this. The United Nations reports that Africa currently has the greatest number of countries that have democratic government since 1960s, and of course we can't. This is far from accurate to call the continent a place of free and fair elections. If we can borrow a leaf from the mass actions yesterday in Kenya and Nigeria, to be very specific, the key issues there as well were free and fair elections, a lack of free and fair elections in the previous rounds. Is this something that we can get to have soon? From reading the statements on the New South Institute, you believe that people with passion can change the world by building democracies and capable governments. Is it possible to get people with passion who can also ensure free and fair elections across democracies in Africa?
Well, I do think that a lot of things are possible with commitment and with passion. The question of free and fair elections, of course, is a very tricky one, and it often relates to not just the design of those institutions, but the larger political economy of elections and politics in countries. South Africa does set an interesting example in this regard. We're a fairly troubled country at the moment. We've had a last decade of great difficulty. It hasn't ended quite as quickly as we expected in 2018. So those challenges continue, and things are looking quite difficult. But from a democratic point of view, South Africa remains fairly robust. Our elections are free and fair. They're fiercely contested. I think there's something in that model there around for other countries. More important though, or as important as the elections though, it's the quality of the legislative environment and the parliaments. And this is where we're doing a lot of work on parliamentary reform. How does one build the institution of parliament, over and above the party political contestation, build the institution of parliament so that it can play its role in a democracy more effectively? One of the challenges in South Africa is that even though we've had this robust democracy and robust elections, we've had a fairly weak parliament. So parliament itself has not played its democratic role effectively. And this was one of the findings, for example, of the state capture inquiry, that the parliament itself had not lived up to its constitutional responsibilities to hold the executive to account. I think these are difficult challenges, but I think they're solvable. It's possible to design institutions in such a way that they can't be captured or gamed by political parties. So I'm quite optimistic in all these areas that there are institutional solutions in many cases to some of these glaring problems. And this is why I think it's so important that the field of public policy is elevated in our context in South Africa and across the African continent and East Africa, but also that we start building the institutions to do the hard work to answer those questions in our local context. And that's very much what the NSI is trying to do, both in South Africa but across the African continent. So look out soon for an NSI office in Nairobi potentially. That I would love.
All right, thank you very much. That is Mr. Chapkin, who's the director of the New South Institute in Johannesburg. A very important conversation we're having there on democracy in Africa, and of course what the citizens and the governments can do together to build an effective and accountable institutions. Working on government and public action, strengthening delicate democracies is what they're doing over at the New South Institute. Thank you very much for creating time for us. Very early morning over at Johannesburg, but we are hoping that maybe sometime if you are here in Kenya physically, we can get to have this conversation, and also maybe for the various parts of research, policy making that you are doing, we can have a conversation as well.
We would love it.
All right.
Yeah, super.
All right.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, have a good one. Biashara Tuesday is now taking a very short break, and then we're back with more on business. Continue staying tuned. More of these hard-hitting conversations are coming to you. If you have any questions, please send them to us at KUTV Kenya. SMS/WhatsApp numbers here. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ivor Chapkin. I'm the director of the New South Institute. We're a practically minded organization that works on building and supporting government and public institutions, especially in what we call the New South, those areas of the world dealing with the legacy of state capture and corruption, with authoritarian and autocratic rule, with fragmentation in societies and potentially even civil war situations. Some of us at the New South Institute have played an important role in interrupting state capture in South Africa. We believe that 30 years of democratic rule in South Africa as a post-colonial situation provides important lessons both for going forward in South Africa, of building institutions and creating administrations better able to deliver services. But we think there are also lessons for other places in the world, especially in countries similar to South Africa in the New South. We think this is especially important in the current situation where democracies really are on the back foot, where authoritarian and autocratic models of governance have renewed prestige, especially in the global south. In all the work we do, we take an institutional perspective. We are focused on developing practical solutions to the major policy challenges in the countries in which we work. We work in several areas. We have a great expertise in dealing with and understanding state capture and corruption, work which has gathered and garnered large interest from around the world and increasingly from the Balkans and from Eastern Europe. We have a great expertise in civil service reform, in understanding what needs to happen, but also potentially how to do it. We work on bringing intelligence and police agencies under civilian and democratic control. We work on the government of migration. We work on welfare reform. And in all of this work, we work comparatively, building relationships with institutions doing similar kinds of work elsewhere in the New South. We've given a lot of thought to our name, the New South Institute. For a South African organization, the term evokes an older term, the New South Africa, with the promise of dealing with the legacy of apartheid within the framework of a constitutional democracy. Of course, the term evokes the notion of the global South, referring also to an older term, the Third World, both as a geography but also as an emancipatory project. We think the term also refers to the BRICS. And with it the promise of thinking the post-colonial experience in relationship to the post-socialist experience. In this way, we are building a vibrant and innovative intellectual community with the view of developing practical solutions for institution building and